Good morning, and thank you for those who've already joined us for our function focus webinar around Sage Intacct Planning. It's 11 o'clock on the nose, so I'm just going to give it an extra couple of minutes while we wait for people to join. Likely to start about 2 minutes past. Thank you. Okay, so we'll get started. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to be running through a presentation and a demonstration of our module Sage Intacct Planning. And I'm just going to run through a few introduction slides for you, and then I'll hand over to Marvin to get started. So my name's Laura Lee. A few of you might know me if you're a customer with us on the direct side for Sage Intacct. I manage our team of customer account managers. So again, if you're with us direct and not through a business partner, then one of my team on the screen here will be your dedicated customer account manager alongside your customer success manager. I've been with Sage 10 years. I've been with Sage Intacct 3 years. Okay, and I'll hand over to Marvin for his introduction.
Good morning, everyone. As Laura said, my name is Marvin. I'm an industry principal consultant at Sage Intacct. I've been here for roughly 3 years, so joined similar time with Laura during the Sage Intacct launch in the UK. So I suspect I've probably engaged with some of you over the years, and today my focus is on the Sage Intacct product and the Sage Intacct Planning application and how it adds value to the existing Sage Intacct product. I tend to engage primarily with software and technology organizations, but today, really owing to the nature of this application, we're really going to keep a general focus and lens around the discussion today.
Thank you, Marvin. I'll just run through some housekeeping and then we'll get started. Lovely. So we're going to be opening up the questions box, and we will pause throughout the demonstration to answer any questions that come through. If we don't manage to get to everything, then there will be a little bit of time at the end, and anything that we don't get around to or can't answer today, we will come back to you directly. We will have a survey for you at the end of the webinar, so please do ensure to give us some feedback on there. You can ask for callbacks, ask any questions that you didn't ask on the session, and give us some ideas about what you might like to see in future sessions. As always, we will be posting the recording into the community. There will be an option within the survey to ask for some help registering for the community if you haven't done so already. And please feel free to ask questions there. They really are encouraged. Thank you. Over to you, Marvin.
Thanks, Laura. So firstly, thanks again for taking the time to join today's session, really around the Sage Intacct Planning product, but also some of the capability that it adds above and beyond the Sage Intacct financial platform. Today, we'll be focusing on a few areas across the entire planning cycle, which include the creation of budgets, integrating and passing information between planning and financials, or core actual financials, looking at some forecasting, and then also some scenario modeling and reporting wrapped around the entire piece. So hopefully by the end of today's session, you should be a little bit more comfortable with what Sage Intacct is, where it's applicable, and the areas within your natural planning cycle that it can really help to address. As Laura just mentioned, we have set some time aside for the Q&A, but for those who are new to GoToWebinar, there is a question or chat function. Please do use that throughout the session. We intend to pause at least a couple of times just to address any questions as they come through. Following that, you also have some next steps and other ways to reach out if you do have questions that arise after the session as well. So before I get into the actual product itself, just wanted to really outline and position what Sage Intacct Planning is, and really where the need for Sage Intacct Planning really arises. So if we think about some of the challenges that exist today in a planning environment or within the planning process, typically there are some operational challenges that are just dominated by the fact that if you're planning, particularly in a manual or Excel or spreadsheet driven environment, there are typically communication silos that can be created as a function of different people working in different versions. And with the best will in the world, there isn't really the ability to collaborate effectively on that basis. So that's kind of one of the key drivers that drives that particular challenge. Equally, on the note of working in multiple applications or working in multiple spreadsheets or versions, there's an element of duplication of effort that may exist, or even just version control and some errors that can arise to different people working within the same document at a given time, particularly in a remote environment as we tend to exist in today. And then finally, and unsurprisingly, a combination of those two components typically really results as a symptom of poor reporting or the inability to get the right level of forecasting and visibility and be able to pivot quickly within what is probably now an ever-changing market. So we'll really look to see how Sage Intacct looks to address some of these kind of core operating challenges. Firstly, as a tool to aid planning, but then actually, broadly speaking, to drive business insight alongside the core financials and the reporting that comes with Sage Intacct itself. So what is Sage Intacct Planning? Well, it creates effectively a real-time planning environment that's highly connected with your actuals, both to share and create the outputs of your plans, so you can measure actuals against performance in Sage Intacct, but also to use those actuals as a springboard to create those existing budgets and start that planning exercise. So there's that really tight symbiotic relationship between the two platforms, and really what Sage Intacct Planning does is it alleviates all of the concerns around that planning cycle. So it allows organizations to have individuals that are responsible for the budget or the planning exercise to be able to communicate information, share information, use templates, see the full financial picture of information through dashboards and pre-built reports. Because it's so tightly integrated and connected with your core Sage Intacct accounting, you're able to effectively trust those numbers and know and refresh them at any moment in time to really get that real, true financial picture. And then more relevant to this current environment, it really allows organizations to proactively scenario plan. So model based on drivers, taking the inputs of a budget, playing around with it to see what the outputs would potentially look like without necessarily A, disrupting the existing budget, and B, creating or reviewing or revising those budgets themselves. So really useful way to kind of extend the level of reporting capability that you have within Sage Intacct. So let's take a look at what that looks like in person, in the system. So by now you should be seeing my Sage Intacct dashboard. Very busy dashboard, I do appreciate, but hopefully this is relevant, or components of this is relevant to you as you run your reporting within Sage Intacct. So my dashboard has some KPIs at the top, which are focused on those account groups. It has reports and metrics, which are drillable, as is the ability to filter amongst different dimensions as you currently have today. Now, one of the key advantages, as I mentioned earlier, is really that connection, that inherent connection with Sage Intacct. So what we're able to do is if I take this particular report, which is potentially a report that you're dealing with today, it's showing me some actuals against a budget or a particular version of a budget, show me a variance in a prior year comparison. So again, potentially, hopefully, a report that is part and parcel in how you interact with it today. As standard in Sage Intacct, I'm able to drill and interrogate the information provided I'm in the right role with suitable permissions. But when connected with Sage Intacct Planning, what I'm able to do is really extend that lens beyond just the figures and actually see the context that drives that. So historically, without Sage Intacct Planning, if I wanted to review this particular budget figure, it would take me through to the particular budget level details or the budget report, which in this case is a particular budget that exists within the system. So in this case, my master budget scenario A. But and that figure that I've drilled into is the figure based on the filters that exist on my dashboard. So the fact that I've drilled into December takes me into the for that particular account group, or that account name is taking me through to the budget figure for that component in that given month. Now, if I was to drill into that particular figure, because I'm dealing in a scenario where I've got Sage Intacct connected highly with Sage Intacct Planning, what this will naturally do is will take me through to, in this case, a view-only view of my particular budget itself. So here, in this case, because I drilled into that services line, if I again query December of that month, I'm looking at that same £173,000 or dollar figure on that basis. So adding a little bit more context to the detail behind that. Now, if I was in edit mode, I'd be able to kind of make changes to some of this information either on the fly or be able to make changes based on models and drivers, which we'll talk about later on in the session. But this just gives you an idea of what an individual who maybe had view-only access to certain budgets would still be able to interrogate and interact with the budget without necessarily making changes and see that wider picture. This is just one of the views that I can look at that budget in. Again, filtered and truncated because I'm looking at a particular service budget line for a particular time period. But if I wanted to see the broader context around this budget as a whole, what I'm able to do by viewing my sheets, which are effectively pre-built reports that come with Sage Intacct Planning, I'm able to see where this budget sits within the wider context of my performance and my planning analysis. So if I look at and focus on the same entity, which in this case was the US West, and I focus on that services line, which is the line I pulled through, again, when I review, I'm able to see, and if I drill into December, I'm able to see that 173 figure is really just one component of a wider budget, which is made up of a ton of different components and a ton of different other figures that are being driven from Sage Intacct Planning. But equally, critically, because that information is connected and shared with Sage Intacct, when I look at Sage Intacct and I look at my budget for this actual, for anything on this page that is related to this connected budget, I'm able to see that impact and really measure performance and measure the variances against those budgets as I can today in standard, regardless of how I bring a budget into Sage Intacct. So not losing any of the functionality that exists within Sage Intacct or the reporting capability of the financial report writer, but actually enhancing an individual who's focused on planning to really dive deeper into that planning arena on that basis. I can do the same to see the impact of this budget based on my cash and actually what that means to my balance sheet over time. So I'm able to see how this impacts the wider piece throughout. I can even go into things that may not necessarily exist in Sage Intacct. Now, one of the advantages of living in the planning environment of the world is I can start to bring some management information that may not necessarily be driven by financial postings. So I can start to look at bookings which may precede revenue that hits my P&L. So maybe I may want to even take a lens and look at headcount on that basis. Again, I'm able to view the relevant information to whatever my remit based on the permissions that are set, again, just like Sage Intacct, based on roles and permissions that ensure that I only have access to information that's shared to me and the right level of access to that level of detail. So for example, when I look to view headcount information, I can ensure that only the right individuals have access to the sensitive information that is driven on that particular basis. But this is just one of the ways in which I can view and interrogate and interact with that information. I also have the ability to filter that information and really kind of sharpen my focus in different ways. So for example, again, I came in, you may recall, I came through looking at revenue services for a particular entity. Equally, if I wanted to pivot my focus to look at costs, for example, again, maybe for the same entity or any entity that I wish to use, again, because Sage Intacct Planning supports the same connected multi-dimensional framework, I'm able to slice and dice that information in a way that makes sense as to facilitate more comparative reporting with my core financials. But here I can then start to look at that budget broken down, provided I'm capturing that level of detail on my budget, I'm able to see that budget broken down by the various different dimensions that give rise to that. So really on the fly, jumping through from Sage Intacct, I've got immediate access, provided I'm in the right roles, useful permissions, to the level of detail to really start to do some high level analysis on that particular budget. Again, driven from the fact that I was looking at that particular component or that particular view of that budget for that particular time period and for that time, that budget line or accounts group that we're using in Sage Intacct. That's again just one of the ways in which I can filter that through our pre-built reports. What I'm also able to do is leverage real-time dashboards as a way to actually view that information in a slightly more visually appealing graphical setup. Again, that principle of having those departments or whatever other dimensions I wish to budget by are presented, and I have even the ability to filter and show the level of detail broken down, provided I'm budgeting to that level of operational detail on that basis. So with a click of a button from Sage Intacct, I'm able to jump into the planning world, not only review the wider context around the actual budget itself, and this would include any commentary and that exists against that particular building of that budget, but I'm then able to pivot my focus to other areas, whether that's operating expenses, and then also present that information in a way that is relevant to however I want to consume it at that moment in time. Again, because this is all real time, as per the budget, the changes I make to the budget can be pushed back into Sage Intacct to get the right wider level of detail that I need on that basis. So we've taken a look at how we can bring a budget in and really kind of pivot our focus around that budget. But how do we actually get that budget, or how does that budget give rise to existing within Sage Intacct Planning? Well, the first way in which we can do so is by going to a new budget. And in this case, I'm going to jump into a role that has full access into particular areas. As I mentioned, those roles and permissions really govern exactly what a user can do at any moment in time. So if I go into creating a new budget, what I'm presented with are a few options. Firstly, I can choose to use and leverage my existing Sage Intacct data. So as I mentioned earlier, either leverage existing budget data that exists as an output of a previous budget, or even actuals as the basis that I want to start that springboard for my budget planning process. I can choose to upload that from Excel. So if this is really in that initial stage, if I have existing budgets that I need to upload, I've got the ability to do so. And I can also upload it from other shared budgets on templates that are created elsewhere in Sage Intacct Planning. So if I have large planning teams that are operating with different templates, I'm able to effectively either share or actually upload their existing versions as a way to create a budget. So in this case, let's say we're going to go for Sage Intacct. After authenticating and drilling into the Sage Intacct application, what I'm then taken through is a neat wizard that effectively allows me to determine the level of detail and scope that I want to associate to this particular budget. Have the ability to define individual entities or define a budget for a particular entity. But in this case, because I want to operate in a multidimensional way, I'm going to create a budget that actually reflects that of multiple entities. So let's give this budget a working name. So let's say working budget for 2023. When we create that budget, we may say actually we want to create the budget for this particular calendar year. And then the system kind of walks through. Now, because I've selected multiple entities, it already assumes that I care about the concept of location. I've already split my budget into different locations on that basis. So I'm able to select that. Equally, if I wanted to use other dimensions such as departments or customers, if I'm budgeting at that level of detail, I'm able to select that and either define all or individual department customers or dimension subsets on that basis. In this case, I'm just going to stick with those particular two. Again, if I'm looking to bring that more granular operational detail around my employee records, I'm able to pass that information into Sage Intacct Planning on that basis. Now, one of the advantages of being tightly integrated with Sage Intacct is I've actually also got the ability to have that mapping process. So as account information is brought in, the system is aware of how to categorize that, but I still have the ability to override those categorizations, particularly for new accounts. So if new accounts are created since the last time I created my budget, the system will identify based on the account setup what the type of account or type of budget line it wants to apply, but I have the ability critically to change that if required. If I decide I'm happy with those as they are, or I'm not looking to bring that information in, I can again define that. Equally, if I'm dealing in an environment, so for example, if I'm bringing employee data in and that employee data exists across a ton of different accounts that reference a particular budget line from my perspective, I can merge and create that. So for example, if I don't want the breakdown of all the various different accounts that relate to salaries and wages, I can effectively create a group that holds that information together. So in this case, I can create a group that says, or anything that is related to that, call it salary and wages. Or equally, if I didn't want that breakdown of my revenue services, albeit or my revenue, different revenue environments, I could create an existing new budget group to actually set that up on that basis. So I can apologies. So I can set that up on that basis. So what I can now, once I've actually defined where I want to go on with that particular component, if I want to create those merges, I can. If I decide actually I'm quite comfortable with the current setup, what I can do is I can go ahead and actually structure my budget. And this is where I start to build that framework. So if you recall from the previous flow, where I was able to look at my budget by location and then by account and then by department, I'm able to set up that framework here. So here I'm able to say that because I'm dealing in a global budget, I may firstly want to decide that entity or location or sub-location is something I want to have at the top. I may then decide that actually for certain accounts, so if I brought, for example, customers through, I may want to see revenue split down by customers. And in this case, because I brought departments through, I may want to see it by operating expenses broken down by department. So the budget is starting to take shape, respecting the dimensional hierarchy and segmentation I have within my business. Once I'm happy with that information, I can decide again if I want to import any additional information in there, whether that's statistical. So this is pulling statistical information that exists within my Sage Intacct environment, or I can decide for this particular budget, I'm happy to take it as it exists today. And then once I'm happy with that, I then set where I want this budget to kick in. So now in this case, I may say that actually I want this budget to be created based on, because I'm dealing in 2022, I want this budget to be created based on because I'm dealing in 2023, I want it to be created based on 2022 actuals. But I can decide exactly where I want that cutover to occur. So if I say I only really want to plan this as if I'm actually sitting in September moving forwards, then I can bring back where I want Sage Intacct to stop respecting the actuals on that basis. In this case, let's just say I'm happy with the actuals as of the end of the year. So we're really starting the budget as if we're at the start. We're in our planning cycle ahead of 2023. Once I select, I'm happy with that, I can then start to put in any kind of minor adjustments I want to make. So maybe I want to take the actuals and increase revenue by a certain component, or I may want to reduce other components by a certain element. So in this case, let's say I want to increase revenue. I appreciate my operating expenses are potentially going to go up by a component. I may also, in line with inflation, increase employee salaries to then try to allow the system to build that picture for me. By selecting all those components through that wizard that again walks me through every single component, the system now takes that information, goes into Sage Intacct to then address exactly how it's going to build that particular budget. So that can be done in a few minutes or longer, depending on the amount of time or the level of detail that is actually put through in those operational budgets. But while it's doing that, just wanted to recap some of the key kind of components that we've just seen. So that idea of having communication silos that multiple people engaging in a budget without actually being able to see kind of the impact, again, it's taken away. As you saw, I could drill through from my Sage Intacct dashboard, get a view, or while only view only, still got a view of that budget and insight into that budget, again, in real time, provided I've access to that level of information. Equally, in doing so, we're able to reduce that duplication of effort. So again, without having to have multiple teams working and reworking the same budgets, I can have different views and versions of that particular budget on that basis. And then finally, having those out-of-the-box reports that allow me to immediately view the level of detail around that budget, both at the budget level or budget line level, right up to the more higher level dashboards and reports that show what it means from a P&L impact, from a balance sheet impact on that basis as well. So really, I'm driving that collaboration to ensure that budget owners are able to really work together. I'm also ensuring that I can create those different budgets as and when, whether I'm creating them, pulling them from Excel or working through the budget wizard to create those forecasts that make sense. And then finally, I'm able to get those reports in real time. So as soon as that budget's presented, and we'll see shortly as we jump in, our working budget's going to have the ability to look at it across those pre-built reports and across the dashboards as well. I'll just pause now for any questions that may have come up. I don't know if Laura, if we've got any questions at this point.
We do, yeah. We've had one come through from Jane. She's asked, can you do a mixture of importing lines of the budget and allowing Intacct to forecast based on the prior year?
Yeah, precisely. So when it comes to bringing information in, there are a number of different ways in which you can do that. So you can effectively blend those, and you'll see as we walk through the system, I've always got, even at the budget line level. So for example, I may say I'm happy for it to bring 90% of my information in, but actually, and kind of apply those percentage changes as I mentioned. But I actually, for my payroll information, that's going to come in via Excel. So I've got the relevant details. So actually, for those individual budget line, I can decide how much level of detail that I want to bring in on that. You can again use prior years, because as I mentioned earlier, when we look to set up the budget, the wizard says, where are you cutting it? So what year do you think, or what month do you think you're in, and therefore as a result, when should we cut over from actuals to budget on that basis?
Thank you, Marvin. We do have another one come through.
Sure.
Thank you. I saw that when you were setting up the budget just then, there was an estimate of the total lines. What's the maximum number of lines the budget can hold? Our budget this year needed circa 21 million lines with the combination of accounts, departments, dates, locations, etc.
That's an excellent question. I'm not aware of the critical capability or the limit on that basis, but I will check with our technical team to see if there is any maximum on that basis. I don't believe there is, but again, I'll double check on that, particularly in those very high volume millions arena. Typically, where you see impact when having multiple lines is you effectively just get a longer time for that budget to be loaded in on that basis.
Thank you. And Ollie will reach out to you after the session once Marvin's confirmed that for you.
Awesome. So what we're doing here, fantastic, thanks Laura. So what we're doing here then is we're letting the system kick in and create that working budget. You can see in the background, for those astute in the background, you can see that it's starting to build what it thinks that working budget looks like. It's doing a few things. It's taking those actuals from Sage Intacct, and this is where it's really important that it's doing it as of this moment. So if there are any real-time transactions that are posted as I'm doing so, they're going to be captured in this version of the budget that I'm creating. It then identifies and allows me to cancel out any lines that don't necessarily have any revenue in them or don't have any postings in there. So I can really kind of post the lines that I actually do have kind of actuals to go off. Again, slightly less data rich environment, but hopefully you can still see the information can come through. Once I'm happy with that, that can then be used to create and build my budget. And once that budget's built, what you'll see is effectively what we saw before. When I drilled into a budget, immediately I'll have access to the real-time reports. So my P&L, those sheets, they look at things like my P&L and my the cash movements on that basis, the ability to kind of track that level of information. So again, if I jump straight into my sheets, I can see that level of detail broken down, provided I have that level of information within those budget lines. It's immediately able to kind of capture that level of detail across my budget over that period of time. I can see what that means from a balance sheet perspective and what those movements mean across my balance sheet, again, expanded into the level of detail if I'm budgeting at that level across the board. Again, I'm also able to, as I create that budget, I'm able to very quickly jump into a dashboard view of that. So if I wanted to see, right, what does this budget now look like? I can see here I've got data amongst some other components. In addition to having those filters on those dashboards that allow me to pivot my focus into different ways, what I'm able to do is actually create a report on the fly. So this is where the system in either Excel or PDF format allow me to actually either take a screen shot of those individual components and create a PDF document that's kind of neatly packaged them together. Or what I might actually do is say, I like most of those dashboard components, but I actually realize I'm not too fussed about hires and ending cash position. I do care about the P&L sheet, but I maybe want to see it quarterly on that basis. And then I may say I want to see some bookings, which is maybe something I don't necessarily capture out of Sage Intacct today. Again, I may want to see that monthly or quarterly. And then I may say I want to see some budget versus actuals. So again, it's imperative that budget versus actuals, because we're able to load in those actuals, provided we've loaded them in prior to this, we're able to actually see what the impact is. So again, if I may say, I want to see my budget versus actuals on a quarterly basis, what the system then now does is it takes those inputs and some of those shiny diagrams that we've got on our dashboard, and it effectively presents those widgets in a report. So here in a few kind of minutes, it's creating my working budget 23. It's giving me a clear view of what is included within that presentation. It's got the current setup of those dashboards in there, including the individual reports that I've taken. So in this case, breaking down those figures quarterly, being able to see the level of detail that I have around that. So this out-of-the-box ability to not just create that information on the fly that we've just created on there, but actually be able to present that information in a way that is meaningful, powerful, and relevant to the individual users on that basis. So you can see from starting my planning exercise, albeit contrived, starting my planning exercise in starting with Sage Intacct budget figure or actuals figure, coming into planning, applying those additional components that I need. Again, in a moment, we'll look at the inputs themselves and how we can make changes to them, and getting to a dashboard and getting to information that's reportable and to be able to reflect to the business in a matter of minutes. I was able to move that level of information. So again, really driving the ability to move quickly and also leverage that real-time powerful data in Sage Intacct to really bring it to the planning arena where it can be expanded upon to build slightly more contextual detail. I'm going to pause for any other questions before I move on to the slightly more detailed budget to look at some of the operational inputs and outputs themselves.
Nothing
Laura,
further. Nope, we're okay.
Awesome. So if I jump into the slightly different budgets, a slightly different view, got some detail around, and more importantly, some data, some relevant data around key areas. You can see from here, I've got a P&L very similar to the P&L I started with, broken down by different lines with different components on that basis. I've got a number of views that I can actually reflect on this basis. Firstly, I've got those filters at the top, as we saw earlier. So if I wanted to filter by particular segment, I'm able to do so and sharpen my focus. Equally, I'm currently looking at a particular budget, so a particular working budget. If I said I wanted to look at a snapshot of that budget at a moment in time, i.e. a forecast, I can effectively decide to pivot away from my broader budget into the different forecasts that I actually operate with. So again, I may have a Q1 forecast or Q2 forecast. I can effectively create those snapshots and then view them, but also view comparisons. So I may say, well, actually, let's look at the Q1 forecast against where we are today on that basis. So I'm able to effectively view that level of information, whether I'm looking at it from a P&L perspective, or I'm looking at it from a bookings perspective, or I'm looking at it from a cash movement perspective. I'm able to track that level of information as well. Equally, when I'm dealing in my working budget, I still got the ability, provided I've brought enough information in, I've got the ability to look at that information against actuals. So just as we started in the Sage Intacct side, where we can look at budget versus actuals, we're able to, in the same way, look at our budget versus actuals from a planning perspective, again, with the ability at any point to sign into my Sage Intacct instance and pull in the most recent actuals that I need on that basis. Equally, if I wanted to see how that pivots over time, I'm able to then look at my rolling forecast. So I can then start to see when my actuals cut over into my working budget, which in this case is in January 21, I can start to see what that movement looks like over time as well. So really useful filters that exist across all of these pre-built out-of-the-box reports that allow you to reflect and view those changes immediately. And then, as I mentioned earlier, or we saw earlier, I'm able to look at budgets through different lenses. So at the moment, for example, I've got operating expenses that I'm currently looking at by budget line, so by the different components. But if I wanted to view that information by department, provided I have budget level information at that level, I can break it down and see the underlying details that sit under those components. So a lot of that rich multi-dimensional capability that exists in Sage Intacct is almost transported across to allow you to report as effectively as possible in real time. In the same way, I can view this information on a dashboard. I can have several dashboards for my different reporting needs. So I can create as many dashboards, provided I'm in the right role. I can create as many dashboards as I need to reflect the information I want to track. And they may be dashboards from a financial perspective. There may be dashboards from an operational management information perspective. So I can set up those dashboards with the ability to, where possible, add existing widgets. So being able to add those widgets, identify the level of information I need from them, and have them report in real time, and then even be able to create those reports as you've seen on the fly just shortly ago. So I'm able to view that information kind of out of the gate across not just my financial statements, as I mentioned earlier, but also across from a bookings perspective. So for some of the management information that may not necessarily exist. And one of the key things, and we'll revisit the dashboards and the reporting in a moment, one of the key things that really drives a lot of this information is the fact that you have a lot of flexibility with the inputs around this. So for example, if we take a kind of closer look at where that data is coming from, and we kind of take a particular budget line, say for example, my revenue subscriptions, or even my revenue sources, when I select a particular line, firstly, I have the ability to decide whether I want to share that particular part of the budget with an individual. So I've always got the ability to give view or modification access to individuals at any point. I'm also able, even when I'm looking at that particular line in isolation, I can see things like what that line looks like. And from a preview perspective, I can decide to look at that in terms of cash, if I'm focusing on cash in that component. I can even, if I'm putting actuals in there, I can actually look at budget versus actuals data. So provided I've loaded actuals for that period, I'll be able to see a comparison of that level of information there. And I'm also able to define where that information is coming from. So in this case, rather than just loading these figures in and writing those figures in, whether I'm looking at it through grid entry or looking at it through the individual detail area, I'm able to define where I want to pull those figures. Now here, rather than necessarily pulling those figures and writing those figures in the system, what I'm saying is that's coming from a model. And the model is really a way for Sage Intacct Planning to make it easier to be able to replicate and really transcend and push the bottom up details right through to the top level. So in this case, what I've got is a model that looks at assumptions, and those assumptions are effectively really building that picture of that budget or that budget component. So in this case, if I look at my services bookings, for example, I've got a total bookings amount of 317,000, which is coming from calculations that are using some of these fixed assumptions alongside some of the inputs I'm putting in. So I've got inputs around things like my average discount that may be changing or that I can apply some logic and rules to. I've got some inputs around average hours. So I can start to flex some of those inputs to really derive exactly what I need to see from a planning perspective. But at the same time, I'm able to, if I wanted to do some scenario planning on this level of detail, I'm able to do so within the system as well. I can, if I say, for example, I wanted to create a scenario where I raise my prices and I wanted to take the budget as it currently exists, but apply some of those slightly different assumptions to that scenario without hurting my existing budget, I'm able to do so by leveraging scenarios within the system. So I may say, I'm going to create a new scenario, and let's call it service revenue or service item increase. Let's do that. So I can create that scenario, takes my existing setup of the budget, almost a snapshot of the budget, and now I can start to play around with some things. So I may say, what if we decided that looking at this, while it is quite lucrative to have T&M projects versus fixed fee, it makes a lot more sense from a profitability perspective to operate with fixed fee projects. So I may say, well, actually moving forward then, what if we make the assumption that we raise the price of our fixed fee projects, so in this case by 10%, or by 20% to 60K. But I may say that actually I also want to discourage a little bit of that booking of the T&M projects, and we may decide that we're going to raise our hourly rate for T&M projects to try and guide customers towards that. And we may decide that that might anticipate, us doing one fewer T&M project, and maybe that creates enough impact for us to do a ton more fixed fee projects on that basis. So what I can see immediately is, firstly, my 317 has gone to 333 because it's taking into account those components that I'm changing. So even before I'm happy with this, the system is already starting to pick up the impact of that change. If I said I was happy with that and I saved that those changes are tracked, so I can always go back and see exactly what I've changed within this particular scenario. I may decide that I may want to, this scenario is not affecting just cost, but it's also not just revenue, but also cost. So I may say, as a result, our labor cost is expected to go up. So maybe we're going to charge a little bit more for consulting hours on that basis. So again, I can set that in, or I can actually have this entwined. So I don't necessarily have to change things in multiple places. If I ask the system to point to a certain model line, it will pick up those changes on that basis. And one key thing to bear in mind, and really in line with the whole discoverable nature of Sage Intacct Planning, is that as I actually go to these slightly more nuanced operating areas, what I have is really nifty in-help budgeting and sorting and information, the ability to view that information and actually get a on the fly help on that particular component as well, in addition to being able to jump into the help and documentation at any point to actually run through the search file, as you do today in Sage Intacct today. So I've got the ability to go through knowledge articles and knowledge base, but actually on the fly, in the system, in the application, I'm able to very quickly pick up those particular components that I'm viewing. Now, in this case, let's say I'm happy with those changes that I've made to those consulting hours. I go ahead and save that. Now you start to see that as I pivot to other parts of my models, I can see it's showing me that in blue that I've made changes to this model. And then when I look at those changes again, I can see that level of detail. As soon as I've made those changes, I can dive straight to, again, those pre-built reports. If I look at what that means from a P&L perspective, I can see my P&L, for example, for revenue has changed that 333 figure. And if I want to see that scenario against what my working budget looks like, again, I can very quickly immediately see, well, actually in doing so, we've moved from that 317 to 333. And then actually we've had an impact on the COGS as a result of that additional cost of consulting hours that we're capturing on that basis. So, and again, immediately see what that looks like on my balance sheet and see if that's creating any balance sheet or cash movements on that basis. Equally, because this affects bookings, I can start to see the differences that it's going to create to my bookings based on that model as well. So really very quickly and easily able to view not just the changes, but actually the context behind those changes based on that model and that scenario that I'm dealing with. I may even decide actually as part of this scenario, it's really important and imperative for me to, when I look to set this up, I may say that I want to use a different exchange rate. Again, I'm able to set all this level of detail when I'm inputting those scenarios in. If I said, yeah, for the purpose of this particular scenario, let's just say, rather than using the budget rates, we're going to actually fix the exchange rate that we're going to use for this particular component, and then actually define what that exchange rate is between that. So without even upsetting the way in which my existing budget works, I've got this snapshot of view of that information at any moment in time. And as unsurprisingly, that information is not just there to be viewed across my sheets, it's also going to be there on my dashboards as another filter, another lens within which I can look at my dashboard. So now I can start to look at scenario-based dashboards on that basis. I can start to do, if I really wanted to, comparisons on that. So if I said, well, actually, I want to see what that scenario means against my working budget, I'm able to start to get that level of detail and again, export and share that information in a number of different ways. So not making those minor changes, seeing how it affects our net profit, seeing how it passes through all our reporting, and then being able to share and communicate that information. In the same way, if my scenario wasn't just based on one measure, so for example, that's one lens, which is revenue. If I said this scenario is also going to have an impact on my operating expenses, for example, my salaries and wages, I'm able to do so And the key thing around these budgets, just like I can share an individual line, I can share individual in the group of those budget lines as well. And I can also decide to create rules. So if I look at, for example, my operating expenses, if I want to put some standard rules that affect all my operating expenses, I can put them here. Equally, my salaries and wages is a group of individuals. I can apply rules. I can share that information at the top level. I can share individual information, and I can even apply those rules. So the rules that apply to the group level, and then there may be rules that may be relevant to particular individuals within that particular group. So when I look at a certain individual, I may then want to put some additional nuances to the costs that are related to that particular individual on that basis. In the same way, I can, if I'm looking to hire an individual and I've got things like a hire date and I've set profiles of that individual, say, for example, we know we need to hire a director. If I have a profile of that director and have some high level information that's coming from the assumptions that I've set up, I can again make any changes I need on the fly. I can even decide if this director, for example, is going to belong to a certain department or group of departments. I can look to allocate that director's time or their reporting across multiple components. And that allocation in this case may be based on a split percentage. Equally, if I was dealing with an operation expense like my administrative expenses, where I may want to allocate that across multiple components, I can say, well, allocate that based on headcount. And then I can start to look at departmental headcount and any statistical information that I need. So really useful way to just filter that information and push it in the way that makes sense, depending on what I need. And I've even got data tables that allow me to easily enter that information. So if I wanted to add new employees or view information around employees, I'm able to view and interrogate that information on a table that presents the level of details that I want based on the views and filters that I set up. I'm also able to bring that information through different sources. So as we mentioned earlier, that combination of doing some stuff on the system, but also bringing some stuff from external sources. If, for example, some of that information existed in Excel or in another kind of budgeting scenario, and I wanted to pull that in. So let's just say I'm going to take my operating expenses from Excel. I can import that information in and drag a file to import that information in. If, for example, I wanted to use the system's templates to create that, I can push a budget template that's pushing my kind of current setup, just like I can in Sage Intacct, into Excel, populate that level of information, and then use that as a way to effectively re-import or create my import that's coming in. So different ways to bring that information together, different ways to consume that information once they've been brought together. And then at some point, if I decide I'm happy with this particular budget as it stands, and I decide that actually this scenario makes sense, I can choose to merge that scenario into the budget. So I don't have to go back and rekey that information. I'm moving that duplication of effort. I can try different scenarios. When that scenario is the one that I want to merge into my working budget, I can also merge it, and those lines will be affected on that basis, and again be reflected on my reports and on my dashboards to view that and see the impact that's making. At the same time, if I decide at some point that I'm happy to kind of pass that information into Sage Intacct or bring in actuals from Sage Intacct, I'm able to bring that level of detail by connecting with Sage Intacct to find the actuals I need in order to pull in. So if I decided I'm done with this dashboard and I'm done with this report, and I decide that I'm kind of happy to think about exporting that report into Intacct and I'm complete, then I've got the ability to link in and pass that information back on that basis. At any point, actually, I'm just going to pause here for a second, just to make sure there are any questions, because I appreciate we're kind of time.
Yeah, okay, there are a couple here, thanks. So Joe has asked, is there any plans to incorporate workflow to drive the planning process?
So again, like Sage Intacct Planning has an extensive roadmap that pushes additional functionality in there. Again, your account manager will be able to share information around those roadmaps with you and what that's looking like and where the direction is. But in terms of the short answer to that is we are getting those inputs and passing them to the product team. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that comes in sooner rather than it's actually quite a common request.
Thank you. And Jane's asked, can Sage Planning link to Sage Intacct Fixed Asset Register so it will forecast depreciation? And also, can we then add in new capital additions and the respective depreciation this will create?
So just to clarify a kind of, I suppose, a key distinction, it's putting in the Sage Intacct GL data and the statistical information. So provided your information is coming from GL lines and those GL lines are mapped, it will pull that and be able to do so. Where it will require you to build models versus actually pulling the actuals in is when you start to look into those kind of modular applications. So for example, in the contracts module, you've got some schedules that don't necessarily have GL components. It wouldn't necessarily pull those in, but because of the way the models are built, if you have a structure and you have that GL number and you know what your depreciation model is and you know how you're spreading that over time, you can build that as a model in the system so that you can report on it, but it wouldn't necessarily pull or drive the depreciation process, information itself, particularly those that are sitting in those depreciation schedules. You'd have to kind of build that assumption into the model itself.
Thank you, Marvin. That's everything.
Questions, Laura?
Awesome.
Awesome.
That's everything.
Fantastic. So ultimately, what this allows us to do is effectively be able to bring a budget into the system, view all the information that we need across that entire budget, track the changes of those budgets using scenarios or snapshots that we can use forecasts to do, or different versions of those budgets, and then at any point see what that impact is in real time, whether I'm looking at it on my reports or on my dashboard. I can highlight that level of information and then share that with individuals, whether those individuals exist within the Sage Intacct world or those individuals exist within the planning arena on that basis. So what does that kind of look like? Well, those communication silos then get to a point where actually we're having multiple people interact with that budget over time, getting that centralized view of those budgets, which actually ultimately makes that constant planning exercise a little bit easier because you're not having to create things from scratch. You can use scenarios, you can duplicate budgets, you can create new budgets by bringing them into the system in different ways, and then ultimately be able to report on the fly. As you saw, we raised the budget. Yes, it took a few minutes, but we had a couple of thousand lines of a budget pulled into the application, and then immediately able to leverage the out-of-the-box reports to then govern and see that level of information. So ultimately, improving the transparency around the budgeting process, allowing you to, with what ifs and scenario modeling, to really proactively address different planning scenarios and forecast and reforecast, and then seeing that impact and being able to push that impact to revised completed budgets, which once created once pushed out to Sage Intacct, allow you to drill back into Sage Intacct Planning to be able to view, as you saw at the beginning. So that scenario A that we initially drilled on was effectively a budget that was created in the application, played around with scenarios, pushed it into Intacct, viewed against actuals, but always have the ability to draw back and look at the underlying information and the detail and the context behind it. So why Sage Intacct Planning? Well, firstly, self-discoverable. So a lot of and hopefully you found a lot of the pieces that we've touched on today are components that are built by finance for finance to be as intuitive as possible, but ultimately it's governed by help and a help center and knowledge base that is there to help every step along the way. It is connected and very tightly connected, so I can refresh actuals, I can take budget figures, I can create rolling forecasts as a function of that. I do have the ability to then, once that budget's in the system, I'm able to really take that budget and look at it in various different lenses, either through filtering and reporting or through that scenario modeling that allows me to really get to that level of detail. And from those scenario modeling, you can start to really build nets and hierarchies that take models and onto models to get to that scenario. It really gives you that clean sandbox environment to play around with the scenario, and then only once you're comfortable with that, decide to merge that into a budget or create a new budget with it on that basis. And then finally, it promotes collaboration at every single level. So as we're moving through those processes, whether we're passing information between the core operating finance application and the planning environment, or the FP&A team and the core finance team, we're able to ensure the same single source of truth is being respected, but at the same time, both sides are getting the value. So someone in Sage Intacct that has only a Sage Intacct view can look at a budget versus actual report and know that the latest version of that budget, because as Sage Intacct can capture multiple budgets, as long as they select the latest version of that budget, they're able to see the right analysis, the right planning, the right reforecast that exists. Equally, because you're able to pull in actuals to either start your budgeting process or just to provide some budget versus actual comparison and performance measurement, again, you're able to ensure that both sides are connected and collaborate at any one point. And that's all governed by the rules and permission protocols that ensure that at every single level, even down to budget lines. So for example, my headcount or my staff and payroll information can be accurately kind of segmented away and protected from individuals that don't need access to it on that basis. I know we've asked some questions on the way, but I just wanted to leave a few minutes for any final kind of questions and thoughts before we wrap up this particular series.
We'll give it a moment, but there isn't anything currently outstanding.
Fantastic. Awesome.
Yes, I think you're good to go.
Awesome. So yeah, again, I would say thank you for the time and attention for this. I think from a next steps perspective, Laura, what are the kind of key things that you want to highlight and close with?
Yeah, so just did want to point out that I've been made aware that the survey hasn't updated from the last webinar, which talks about fixed assets, but please just use the survey in the same manner and we'll reach out accordingly. You can let us know if you need some support registering for the community, but I do encourage that you join both the function focus group, where you can see previous on-demand webinars such as today, and also the Lunch and Learn group, which is managed by Customer Success and gives some really good webinars about tips and tricks and adoption of Sage Intacct. We do have a webinar coming up on the 17th of May around intelligent purchasing and accounts payable. And the next function focus webinar will be on Sage Intacct collections on the 25th of May. So we look forward to seeing you again. That's everything. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I hope you found the session useful.
Thanks, Marvin. Goodbye.
Cheers.